when a life-and-death emergency collided. With systemic bias no one was ready for the fallout. It was close to midnight. When Malcolm Bryant's phone buzzed on, his nightstand jolting him from the few hours of sleep he had managed to squeeze in. He blinked groggily at the screen, but when he saw the hospital's number, his heart sank. Calls at this hour rarely brought good news, he answered on the second ring. Malcolm here, he said, sitting up and rubbing his face. Dr. Bryant, this is Amy from the ER. The voice on the other end rushed. We've got an emergency. Teenage girl in critical condition, car accident out on Highway 74. It's bad, we need you here. ASAP. His pulse quickened. He was one of the only surgeons in all of Monroe County certified to handle high-risk vascular trauma, if they were calling him. It meant she didn't have much time. I'm on my way, he replied, already swinging his legs over the side of the bed as he grabbed his keys and slipped into his sneakers. His mind raced. Highway 74. How many times had he warned the town council about that stretch of road? Poor lighting, sharp turns and narrow shoulders made it a death trap, especially for young drivers. He sprinted to his car, a sleek black Tesla he'd worked years to afford, and tore out of his driveway into the quiet, dark streets. He lived just 20 minutes from the hospital, but tonight, every second felt like an eternity. The girl was the daughter of Police Chief Richard Hall, a fact Malcolm learned as he sped down Main Street, the hospital paging him with updates. He knew the chief well enough. They'd crossed paths at town events. Hulk wasn't a bad guy, but Malcolm also couldn't ignore the way the man avoided eye contact when race came up in conversations. But there was no time to dwell on that. Now someone's life was on the line, and that was all that mattered. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, weaving through the occasional stoplight, praying he wouldn't hit and traffic, but he wasn't prepared for what came next. As he approached a four-way intersection flashing red and blue, lights appeared in his rearview mirror, followed by the sound of a siren. Are you kidding me? He muttered under his breath, his foot instinctively easing off the gas. He pulled over, heart pounding, for reasons that had nothing to do with the emergency, but what should have been a brief explanation and a warning about his speed turned into something far worse. Dr. Malcolm Bryant rolled down his window, gripping the wheel tightly as the officer approached. The sharp beam of a flashlight flickered across his face. Moment, thinly blinding him. He squinted, trying to keep calm, though his heart was pounding. This wasn't his first encounter like this, and he knew how these situations could go. The officer leaned down, his face unreadable under the brim of his hat. Do you know how fast you were going? He asked, his tone clipped. I'm sorry, Officer. Malcolm began, his voice steady but rushed. I'm a surgeon. I just got an emergency call to get to the hospital. Someone's life is on the line. The officer's expression didn't change. He shot the flashlight into the car, eyeing Malcolm's scrubs and the hospital badge clipped to his pocket. License and registration, the officer demanded, ignoring the explanation. Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he complied, reaching for his wallet and the glove compartment. Look, I know I was speeding, but it's because a young girl, Police Chief Hulk's daughter, no less, is in critical condition. If I don't get to the hospital, she could die. The second officer, who had been standing back now, stepped closer, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. And why should we believe you? He asked, his tone laced with suspicion. Malcolm inhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay calm. This wasn't the first time he'd been doubted or treated with hostility for simply existing in spaces where people didn't think he belonged. My badge is right here, he said, holding it up for them to see. I'm a surgeon at Monroe County General Hospital. Please call them if you need to, but I don't have time for this. The first officer took the badge and inspected it, his partner stepping back slightly but not relaxing. Minutes dragged on as they radioed in to verify his identity. Ignoring his repeated pleas about the urgency of the situation, Malcolm glanced at the clock on his dashboard. 7 minutes had passed since they'd stopped him. 7 minutes that could The difference between life and death. His hands began to tremble, not out of fear, but sheer frustration. Officer, I'm begging you, Malcolm said, his voice cracking slightly. Every second counts. If it were your daughter, you'd want me to go. The first officer finally handed back his documents, but didn't move away from the car. It's your lucky night, he muttered, though there was no apology in his tone. Slow down. Malcolm didn't wait for further permission. He pulled back onto the road, his tires screeching slightly as he accelerated. The hospital was only 10 minutes away now, but it felt like an eternity. But as Malcolm raced toward his destination, he had no idea that the incident wouldn't end there. Dr. Malcolm Bryant's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he sped toward the hospital. His heart was racing, his mind still stuck on what had just happened. The delay, the questions, the way the officer's doubt had chipped away at the precious time he needed to save a life. He tried to push it from his mind, tried to focus on the surgery ahead, but the anger lingered. 10 minutes later, he screeched into the hospital parking lot as he ran through the sliding doors of the emergency room. Amy, the ER nurse who had called him, waved him over. She's in critical condition, Amy said quickly, leading him down the hall. Internal bleeding, possible vascular rupture. The paramedic stabilized her, but she's fading fast. What her BP? Malcolm asked, switching immediately into professional mode. Dropping 60/40 when we brought her in. He nodded, slipping on a surgical gown. As they reached the Oleton Prier, we don't have a second to lose. The patient lay on the operating table, pale motion less and hooked up to a web of machines. Malcolm's chest tightened as he saw the familiar face of Police Chief Hulam through the small observation window above the the chief's hands were pressed against the glass, his face a mix of fear and helplessness. Malcolm didn't have time to think about that. He focused entirely on the task at hand, guiding his team as they opened the girl's abdomen, worked to stop the bleeding. The O was silent except for the rhythmic beeping of monitors and Malcolm's clear, steady voice directing every step. But despite the focus in the room, Malcolm's mind kept drifting to what had happened earlier. How much time had been wasted? Could those precious minutes have made a difference in how critical her condition had become? He shoved the thought aside and focused on saving her. Now 2 hours later, the surgery was over. Malcolm stepped out of the exhausting but relieved. He found Chief Hull waiting in the hallway, pacing back and forth. The man froze when Malcolm approached, his eyes locking onto the surgeon's, blood-stained. Scrubs, she's stable, Malcolm said simply. It was close, but we got her in time. She's in recovery. Now Hull exhaled deeply, his shoulders sagging as relief washed over him. Thank you, he muttered, his voice thick. Thank you for saving my little girl. Malcolm nodded but didn't respond. Immediately he should have walked away, but something in him held him back. Maybe it was the anger still simmering from earlier. Maybe it was the sheer absurdity of the night. I almost didn't make it, you know, Malcolm said finally, his voice calm but firm. Your officers pulled me over. They wasted time questioning whether I even belonged on the road, time that could have cost your daughter her life. The chief's face hardened slightly, a flicker of discomfort crossing his features. I'll look into it, he said, avoiding Malcolm's gaze. That's not good enough, Malcolm replied, his voice steady but sharp. This isn't the first time this has happened to me, but tonight it nearly cost someone their life, your daughter's life. If that doesn't make you see the problem, I don't know what will. Hull didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. But the conversation didn't end there, and neither did the night. The hospital corridor felt suffocatingly quiet after Malcolm's words. Chief Hullum stood rooted to the spot, his face unreadable, but the tension was unmistakable Malcolm didn't expect an apology, not immediately. He'd seen the same look too many times before, a mix of guilt, pride, and discomfort. He sighed, exhausted, and turned to walk away. "Wait," Hulk called after him, his voice low. Malcolm stopped but didn't turn around immediately. What exactly happened out there? Malcolm turned back his gaze. "Steady, your officers stopped me for speeding. I told them I was on my way to save a life, your daughter's life, and they didn't care. They treated me like a suspect, not a doctor. I had to beg them to let me go. I lost over 7 minutes. You know how much 7 minutes matters in an emergency." Hulk's face pared and he looked away briefly. I didn't know," he muttered. "That's the problem," Malcolm said, his voice rising slightly. "You didn't know, and you didn't care to know, and that's the same mindset those officers had tonight. It's not just about me, it's about anyone who looks like me in this town. If it hadn't been your daughter, would you have cared about what happened? Would?" Hub's jaw tightened for a moment. Looked like he might argue, but then something shifted. The reality of Malcolm's words seemed to hit him. His daughter's life had hung in the balance, and the same biases he'd ignored for years had almost cost her everything. "I'll handle it," he said quietly. Malcolm shook his head, frustration boiling over. "Handle it? How?" Another slap on the wrist, another memo about treating people with respect. "That's not enough. You have to change the culture, Hulk. You have to lead by example. Because if you don't, it's only a matter of time before someone else's life is ruined or worse." Hulk stared at him, speechless. Before he could respond, a voice interrupted them. "Chief Hulk," one of the nurses called, stepping into the hallway. "Your daughter's awake." Hull immediately turned toward the recovery room, but not before glancing back at Malcolm. There was something in his eyes. Maybe gratitude, maybe regret. But Malcolm didn't wait to find out. He walked away, exhaustion finally catching up with him. As he made his way back to the doctor's lounge to change out of his scrubs, he couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. The look on Hull's face, the way the officers had treated him, the way he'd felt powerless despite his position, his credentials, and his role in saving a life. But as much as he wanted to put the night behind him, he knew it wasn't over. Not yet, because the events of that night were about to ripple far beyond the hospital walls. The next morning, the events of the night before had already begun to spread through the small town of Monroe. Whispers turned into full-blown conversations as news of the police stop and its connection to the police chief's daughter leaked into the community. People were divided. Some defended the officers, claiming they were just doing their job. Others couldn't ignore the glaring reality of what had nearly happened at the hospital. Dr. Malcolm Bryant tried to focus on his patients, but the aftermath of the night clung to him. Colleagues whispered as he passed, some offering him sympathetic looks, others avoiding his gaze altogether. By midday, the hospital administrator called him into a meeting to discuss the growing attention. "We've had reporters calling," she said, her tone cautious. "They asking about your experience last night. Thought you'd want to know before this gets bigger." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his fatigue now paired with frustration. "This isn't just about me," he said calmly. "This is about a system that almost cost someone their life. I'm not going to ignore that." By evening, the story had reached the local news. A journalist asked Chief Hulk about the incident during a press conference outside the police station. Standing stiffly in his uniform, Hulk hesitated. "Before answering, the actions of my officers are under review," he said carefully. "I've spoken to Dr. Bryant personally, and I've assured him we're taking this matter seriously." But Malcolm, watching the press in conference from his living room, shook his head. It was the same tired response he'd heard countless times before. Under review was code for doing nothing. The next day, something unexpected happened. Hulk showed up at the hospital. Malcolm spotted him standing awkwardly in the lobby, holding his hat in his hands. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither man spoke. Finally, Hulk approached. I owe you more than just a thank you, he said quietly. You were right. Last night it made me see things differently. Malcolm studied him for a moment, searching for sincerity in the chief's eyes, and he prompted Hulk sighed. Look older than he had the night before. I've ordered mandatory bias training for every officer on the force, and I'm personally meeting with community leaders to discuss how we can do better. It's not enough, I know that, but it's a start. Malcolm nodded slowly. He wanted to feel relief, maybe even hope, but years of disappointment made it hard to trust. Words alone, it's a start, he echoed, but it's going to take more than training. You've got to hold people accountable. Real accountability. Hulk nodded. Would understand. Before he left, Hullum paused. I don't know how to thank you for and what you did for my daughter, but I promise you I'm going to make sure what happened to you doesn't happen again. Not on my watch. Malcolm didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded and said, We'll see that night. Malcolm sat on his porch, the cool air finally allowing him to breathe. He thought about the girl he'd saved, the 7 minutes he'd lost, and the long road ahead for the town and for people like him. Everywhere change didn't come easy, but maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something. Sometimes it takes a moment of crisis to force people to see what's been broken all along, but seeing is just the first step. What comes next is up to all of us. If you've made it this far, ask yourself this: what would you have done in Dr. Bryant's shoes? What about Chief Hullum? Change begins when we stop looking away. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And let's start having the hard conversations that will lead to real change. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge perspectives, spark conversations, and inspire action.